Hauntings podcast with your host, Jeff Lohman.
Join us as we step beyond the veil where history and mythology collide. Our journey through ancient Egypt's history and hauntings will challenge your perspectives and ignite your imaginations. Welcome to Curse of the Pharaohs, where the past comes alive and the supernatural awaits. Let the hauntings begin. Cursed be those that disturb the rest of the Pharaoh, that they shall break the seal of his tomb, shall meet death by a disease which no doctor can diagnose. Before we begin, we have to understand the belief systems of the ancient Egyptians. Those beliefs were completely founded on the idea of the afterlife. If you could rule in Egypt and did it the right way, according to the gods, you could rule in the afterlife as well. Thousands of years later, we aren't much different than the ancient Egyptians. While the intensity of the beliefs is less dramatic these days, the one thing the Egyptians took seriously above all else was pleasing the gods and entering the afterlife. And for those who mistakenly chose not to abide by the gods of the pharaohs, there would be severe penalties both in this world and the afterlife. As you will see, idle threats might just look like idle threats, but the Egyptians took the threat business to an entirely prolific level. While we certainly cannot prove 100% that these threats congealed into actual harm, the reality is, for those who broke into the tombs, albeit grave robbers or archaeologists, there would be hell to pay for those transgressions. The old saying goes, if you believe in something enough, you are bound to give birth to it. Now, some scholars will tell you that the threats didn't exist in hieroglyphic form, but there are those who have also said that they did. And in the last few decades, they have proven that they existed. Egyptians did use curses to drive the point home. Most of those threats came from private citizens in Egypt on statues and monuments rather than from the royal Egyptian bloodline. However, as I said, there was some found in Egyptian tombs, and some of these pharaohs meant business. So here are some veiled threats. He will be judged regarding it by the great God. I will wring his neck like a goose or like a bird, and cause those who live upon the earth to fear the spirits who are in the west. I will exterminate his survivors. I will not allow their farms to be occupied. As for any people who will make a disturbance in this tomb, or who will destroy its writings, or who will do damage to its images, they will fall to the wrath of Thoth. In Amenhotep's tomb, Hapu's son from the 18th dynasty, he was not fucking around. As for anyone who will come after me, and who will find the foundation of the funerary tomb in destruction, As for anyone who will take the personnel from among my people, as for all the others who will turn them astray, I will not allow them to perform their scribal function. I will put them in the furnace of the king. His race will vomit flame upon their heads, demolishing their flesh and devouring their bones. They will become Apophis on the morning of the day of the year. Now, an Apophis is a divine serpent, etc., etc. They will capsize in the sea, which will devour their bodies. They will not receive honors received by virtuous people. They will not be able to swallow offerings of the dead. One will not pour for them water in libation. Their sons will not occupy their places. Their women will be violated before their eyes. The great ones will be so lost in their houses that they will be upon the floor. They will not understand the words of the king at the time when he is in joy. They will be doomed to the knife on the day of the massacre. Their bodies will decay because they will starve and will not have sustenance, and their bones will perish. Now, whether or not ancient Egyptians believed in curses or not would depend on the person. However, at the time, grave robbing was a big thing. And the one thing that one has to wonder about the royal bloodline specifically is why these locations were not protected better than they were. As we know, grave robbers have pilfered these sites for thousands of years. Only a fraction of royal sites have been kept intact for thousands of years. What is interesting, almost foreboding in a sense, is the fact that a few of these sites, which garnered worldwide acclaim, which hadn't been pilfered by grave robbers, are the ones to have been said to release death upon those who dare entered. Perhaps the most notable Egyptian royal is King Tutankhamun. Tut, the son of Akhenaten, took over the reins at 9 years old. One of the things Tut did was restore ancient Egypt back to the cult belief of Amun. He also moved the base of operations from the royal family from Amarna back to Memphis. And what makes Tut so different is there is so little known about him. His age at death and even his death are subject to debate and has been since 1922. Some claim he died at 14, some say 18. Some have claimed malaria, and some have claimed a leg fracture, and some even say he was poisoned. The reality is we don't know, and perhaps the reason why Tut gets so much press is because of his tomb being opened in 1922, and nothing prior or since has been as rewarding historically. But here is what we do know about him. He was born in the 18th dynasty, which stretched from 1550 BC to 1295 BC. His original name was Tutanhaten. As Tut was growing up, Egypt was going through a swift change. There was a lot of political issues and upheaval. King Amenhotep IV, who was believed to be Tut's father, turned away from the culture's many god systems to worship the sun god Aten. With the switch, Amenhotep changed his name to Akhenaten, and his son would be named Tukhanaten, which translates to the living image of Aten. In 1336, King Akhenaten dies after 17 years on the throne. At that point, a 9-year-old King Tut absorbs the throne. Tut then opened many new temples and restores Egypt to the belief of many gods. Tut would then change his name to Tutankhamun, which meant the living image of Amun. Amun was the god of air. He also changed his throne name to Nebuchadnezzar, which was homage to the old sun god of Re. He would marry Aksunamun, the daughter of Queen Nefertiti and King Akhenaten. That made Aksunamun his half-sister. Tut's reign would be short and not very remarkable other than establishing religious cults. Tut was used by his royal advisors, and the priests used him sort of like a puppet, and they schemed behind his back to take power for themselves. One of the more odd things about King Tut is that his name was removed from monuments and records because of his association with his father Akhenaten. However, his name being deleted from the records is one of the reasons why nobody knew that Tut would be buried in the Valley of the Kings. Now, you're going to have to use your imaginations here. We're going to talk about imprinting and residual hauntings. Now, this is all going to hinge on what you believe. Residual hauntings are simply like a film strip of the past being played over and over and over again. Imprinting is similar, but this typically happens when something very catastrophic happens at a location, be it concentration camps or scenes of a brutal murder, and etc. Now, if we follow the logic of imprinting or residual, then we would need to have some sort of evidence that something very bad happened in a particular location. I just want you to keep that on your mind as we go along. A grave being destroyed or vandalized or a tomb being destroyed could potentially cause some hauntings. How many times have we heard the stories that someone buys an old home, begins to revamp it, and then suddenly weird stuff begins to happen? Once again, this is based on what you may personally believe. If we follow that logic, what's to say that Tut's tomb being opened and pilfered in 1922 didn't disturb something? What if I told you during the 18th dynasty people were sacrificed? Wouldn't that sort of double down on our theory if we believe in residual hauntings or some sort of imprinting? The royal family believed the purpose of sacrifices were to help the deceased maintain their social status and lifestyle in the afterlife. It also was a way for the pharaohs to show their power and strength. They just didn't kill. They would slaughter people for that very reason. Amenhotep II killed 7 Syrian princes at the temple of Amen in Karnak. He then hung up the bodies on the walls of the temple for all to see. He killed people at his own coronation. Prisoners were also killed at temples throughout the 18th dynasty. The Egyptians were big on retainer sacrifices. After a slave would die, they would dismember them, basically butcher them, and so that, in the afterlife, the slave would continue to serve them. They would use ritual smiting as well, and many of the royals used this process. It meant that those who angered them, those who were enemies, were made examples of in glorious fashion. The royals also used de jure. De jure was a festival thrown by the royals, which at its culmination included a man being bound by rope or hemp, and a priest stabbing him to death in front of the masses. These are all things that the royals did in different dynasties. Making it more gruesome is often after a pharaoh died, his slaves or servants were often buried alive with the pharaoh. This likely was carried on from the first dynasty, where most of the tombs of pharaohs were accompanied by more than 100 graves, which were usually servants or slaves. So when we look at it, it would make complete sense as to why, with so many horrific events that took place, why there might be some imprinting or residual stuff going on. Now, before we get into King Tut and Howard Carter and the curse, I want to bring you some of the methods in which the royals used to get their point across in terms of torture for misdeeds. It just shows you how it might just be possible that disruption of the graves, sacrifices, and brutal punishment spurred residual or imprinting hauntings. There were 9 various ways Egyptian rulers got rid of problem people in Egypt, which may lead to more possibilities of imprinting and residual hauntings. Number 9, impalement. Impalement wasn't a threat, it was their go-to method for punishment. Unlike Vlad the Impaler, they did stuff a little differently. They would put a post into the ground, tie the victim up by his or her hands. 2 guards would then force the victim's legs apart, and a third would drive a sharpened log up the victim's rectum and push it out until it protruded from his ribs or mouth. The second way they did this was to hoist the victim up on a rope and slowly drop him down on the sharpened log, which was point side up and cemented into the ground. This was not done privately, but rather in front of massive crowds. Number 8, banishment. Those who angered the pharaohs were not just punished, but they were banished. They would send these criminals to Rhino Kalura. Rhino Kalura was a prison city where they were left to fend for themselves. Ancient Egyptians knew that these criminals would kill one another, and that's why those deemed criminals would be sent there. While the threat of these prisoners just scaling a wall and coming back to an Egyptian society was noted, the royals had a way of making sure that that would never happen. Before these criminals were sent to Rhino Kalura, their noses would be cut off. This way, if somehow they escaped and returned, everyone would know who they were and where they came from. This process was also used for adulterers. They would remove the ears and the noses of those who committed adultery. Number 7, Hand removal. For those who dared to rob a tomb, the consequences were, to say, well, barbaric. The pharaoh would either remove one hand or both or cut their heads off. Number 6, drowning. This method was used for repeat offenders. The victims would be bound hand to feet. They would be sealed in a basket and thrown into the Nile River. To the Egyptians, water was the ultimate judgment. They believed that drowning was a death that would not allow you to go into the afterlife. Number 5, slavery. If you got convicted, you would be forced into hard labor slavery. Some built pyramids, some built ships, and some were sent to mines. They would be beaten regularly, and many of the remains of slaves showed dozens of fractures. Number 4, the beating of 100 blows. Victims of this would be whipped, shredded, and stabbed. This was a particular punishment for anyone who stole animal hides. Hieroglyphics tell us that this was the exact punishment for theft. Number 3, burning. Once again, adultery was taken seriously in ancient Egypt, and if you were stupid enough to do this, there were methods to handle you. The victim or adulterer in this case would be forcibly thrown into a massive fire. It wasn't just specific to adultery either. If you went against the pharaoh, talked shit about the pharaoh, or were seen as a traitor, it was the pyre for you. They believed that these criminals without a physical body could not enter the afterlife, and this is why this method was chosen. Number 2, buried alive. For the victims of this method, they would be placed in a tomb, then placed in a sarcophagus, and a slab of cement would be placed on top. The victim would eventually suffocate to death. Number 1, the crocodile. It wasn't just enough to punish what the Egyptians viewed as criminals, but if you were lucky enough to enter the afterlife, Anubis would be there for further justice and judgment. For those stupid enough to continue a criminal path, there was only one way to handle that. If you were a first-time offender for theft, usually the Egyptians went light. You were forced to return the item or pay the person back for the theft. However, if you were stupid enough to continue to pilfer, they had a way of resolving that and quick. They would be walked to the Nile and thrown in the water to be eaten alive by the crocodiles. When you take everything into consideration, everything macabre that we have discussed, it might make sense as to why perhaps in one way or another fucking with a tomb might just bring you some serious problems. Howard Carter was a British archaeologist and Egyptologist born in 1874 in Kensington, England. It was during his childhood while playing in the Amherst mansion named Diglington Hall that he came upon Egyptian relics collected by the Amhersts, which sparked his interest. Carter, who excelled in art, was well liked by Lady Amherst, who eventually would commission Carter and send him to Egypt to assist Percy Newberry in the excavation of the Middle Kingdom tombs at Beni Hassan. A 17-year-old Carter, who in 1892 went to work with Flinders Petrie for one season at Amarna. Amarna was the capital established by Akhenaten. From 1894 to 1899, he went to work with Edward Neville at Deir el-Bashari, where he recorded the wall's relics at Hatshepsut. In 1899, Carter would be promoted to Inspector of Monuments in Upper Egypt in the Egyptian Antiquities Services. While based in Luxor, he would oversee a dozen excavations and restorations in Thebes. He would also work in the Valley of the Kings, supervising the exploration of the valley with American archaeologist Theodore Davis. By 1902, Carter was off exploring the Valley of the Kings on his own. He began his exploration on the west side wall of the valley's basin. Within 3 days, he would stumble upon stone steps and a sepulchral entrance. It was followed by a corridor and a sarcophagus chamber. It would lead to the resting place of Thutmose IV's tomb, and was followed by finding a blue scarab with the name Queen Hatshepsut's name on it. While it was limited success for Carter, locals accused Carter of tomb robbing, and fearing upheaval, he was removed from Upper Egypt and placed in Lower Egypt. Whatever the naysayers claimed, Carter was particularly proficient in excavations, mapping, and keeping protection on excavated sites. Because of that, the Antiquities Services funded Carter to excavate more sites, giving him carte blanche to do whatever he wanted. In 1905, Howard Carter would remove himself from the antiquity services because of an event that took place between Egyptian site guards and French tourists, which became known as the infamous Saqqara Affair. French tourists would get too close to the site, refuse to follow the rules, and Egyptian guards went berserk, beating the French tourists. When France officially complained about the event, Carter backed the Egyptian guards, but the damage was done for Carter personally. Carter would resign and would head back to Luxor. For the next few years, he didn't have any work until 1907 when Lord Carnarvon would hire Carter to excavate the noble tombs near Thebes. For the next 16 years that Carter would work, he would never find any of the riches that he thought he would. In 1914, Lord Carnarvon got permission to dig in the Valley of the Kings and hired Howard Carter. Carter's main job was to find tombs that earlier expeditions had missed. In particular, they were looking for the tomb of King Tut. As they began a systematic check, World War I would break out, and Carter left to go work for the British as a courier and translator. 3 years later, he would return to the dig site in 1917. They didn't find anything, and Lord Carnarvon was ready to call it a career, was going to withdraw money from the project. However, Carter talked him into digging for one more season. As Carter went back to work in November of 1922, a worker found a step buried beneath the sand. It was buried deep beneath old huts. Carter would order his crew to begin a dig, and eventually they would come to a plastered door. The doorway was stamped with cartouches. Carter ordered the hole to be buried and then sent a telegram to Lord Carnarvon back to England. 2 weeks later, Carnarvon would arrive in the Valley of the Kings with his daughter, Evelyn Herbert. Now, if you're familiar with the Mummy series with Brendan Fraser, you will know the storyline of Evie. They based her off a character which was Lady Evelyn Herbert. They began to dig again, and once they got to the doorway and Carter got a better look, he realized what they were actually looking at. The seal of King Tut was found on the outer door. They would reach the top left side of the doorway and peek inside. To his shock, the gold glowed from inside the tomb. They had to reach out to the Egyptian Department of Antiquities because by law, they had to enter the tomb with them. Late that night, however, Lord Carnarvon, Lady Evelyn, and Carter entered the tomb alone, which was against Egyptian law. The next morning, after officials arrived, Howard Carter had the lights rigged down the shaft into the burial chamber. It was time to enter the tomb. The amount of gold and artifacts was insane. Gilded couches, chests, thrones, and shrines. They followed the shaft and found two other main entries to the shaft. One they thought was the official burial chamber, and the other was a false chamber. Outside the first door, there were two massive life-size statues of King Tut. While there was evidence of a bust in at some point, the robbers never got to the actual chamber. Inside, over 5,000 items were counted. They would begin to catalog everything, and on February 16th of 1923, Carter opened the sealed door. Inside, the gold beamed off the walls and the giant sarcophagus was seen. The tomb or burial chamber was the most intact burial chamber that had ever been found in history. Lord Carnarvon upset Egyptians and Carter by refusing to allow the press in. Instead, he allowed the highest bidder access, and the New York Times won. Many felt that money grabbing was wrong because this was a world historical find. Keep in mind here, a few weeks later, Lord Carnarvon would be dead. For the next year, Carter cataloged and moved items to Cairo. In 1934, a letter was received by Carter from Alan Gardinier. Gardinier was gifted an amulet. Gardinier thought the gift was from the tomb and was against taking anything that came from the tomb. Turns out, Carter had in fact stolen it from the tomb and never marked it down. Turns out it wouldn't be until the year 2022 that the world would find out that Carter stole a treasure trove from the tomb. In 1932, the tomb was emptied and Carter retired. While he kept a home in Luxor, he went back and forth from England to Luxor, but his reputation was waning due to rumors of having sex with hired labor and stealing items and having them shipped secretly to London. By March of 1939, however, he would be dead. After his death, there would be an investigation into his wealth. When authorities entered his home, they found dozens of items from Tut's tomb in his home. Each was not indexed in Egypt. All the items would eventually be given back to Egypt. However, odd things began as soon as Carter opened the door to Tut's tomb. Once the door was opened, an assistant, who was also an archaeologist by the name of James Breasted, explained that Carter sent a messenger from the site to his house in Luxor. As the man got into Carter's property, he heard voices and a loud cry. As he entered the home, he found Carter's prized canary being engulfed by the biggest cobra he had ever seen. As he slowly entered, the cobra turned, and the canary was in its mouth. What is odd is living in the area, Carter had his home cobra-proofed. He had paid a ton of money to ensure that no snakes or scorpions could gain access to his home. But here was the largest cobra he had ever seen in his life. The cobra is a symbol of the royal family in Egypt. The New York Times reported on this a week later. The first death was Lord Carnarvon. He died months after the tomb was opened. He died essentially of blood poisoning. According to doctors, he had been bitten by a mosquito and while shaving cut it open. It would become infected and killed him. Oddly, others on the site had been bitten by mosquitoes, and one of the ways that they dealt with the welt was to cut it. It was a common thing in those days. Lord Carnarvon was the only one who died as a result. As a result of this, Benito Mussolini, who had been gifted a mummy, immediately had it removed and sent back to Egypt. What made this idea of a curse grow was the inscriptions on the tomb of King Tut, and that royal priests would enact revenge for the pilfering of his tomb. 6 weeks prior to the death of Lord Carnarvon, Arthur Weigel joked that Carnarvon, upon entering the tomb, had 6 weeks to live, and he was correct. Carter had written in his journal that one night while working in the tomb, he had spotted a jackal, which appeared to be an exact replica of Anubis. Anubis was the guardian of the dead, and while it scared Carter, he lamented that it was on his mind and it was only playing tricks on him. George J. Gould I, who had visited the tomb upon opening, would die a few months after entering the tomb. He died on the French Riviera after developing a fever that doctors could not understand. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, who was the radiologist hired to x-ray Tut's remains, would be dead in January of 1924 from a rapid formation of skin cancer and died on the operating table. A.C. Mace, who was on Carter's excavation team, would die in 1928. Pleurisy, which is a lung infection, doctors didn't know how he even acquired the infection. Mervyn Herbert, Lord Carnarvon's half-brother who visited the tomb, would die strangely of a pathogen-borne malaria in 1929, once again baffling doctors. Captain Richard Bethel, who was Carter's secretary on site, died November of 1929 as a result of some form of smothering. James Breasted would die on his last trip to Egypt. Hugh Evelyn White, an archaeologist, would commit suicide in one of the tombs in 1924. Prince Ali Kamal Bey would be murdered in 1923. Sir Lee Stack would be murdered in Cairo in 1924. Death was not just attributed to King Tut's tomb either. In 1699, Louis Pennecher wrote an account in which he recorded how a Polish traveler bought 2 mummies in Alexandria and embarked on a sea journey with the mummies in the cargo hold. The traveler was alarmed by the reoccurring visions of 2 specters in stormy seas and did not abate until the mummies were thrown overboard into the ocean. Zawi Hawass recalled that as a young archaeologist excavating at the Kam Abu Billow, he had to transport several artifacts from the Greco-Roman site. He stated that his cousin died on that day and his uncle died on its first anniversary, and that on the 3rd anniversary his aunt died. Years later, when he excavated the tombs of the builders of the pyramids at Giza, he encountered the curse. All people who enter this tomb will make evil against this tomb and destroy it. May the crocodiles be against them in the water, the snakes be against them on land, and may the hippopotamus be against them in water, and the scorpion on land. Though claiming not to be superstitious, Hawass decided not to disturb the mummies. However, he also claimed that he was later involved in the removal of 2 child mummies from Bahira Oasis to a museum and reported that he was haunted by the children in his dreams, a phenomenon which he claims did not stop until the mummy of the father was reunited with the children in the museum. While many of the deaths scientifically can sort of be worked out, the issue has always been how spontaneous they were. While we cannot blame a curse on the death of a dozen or so people, what we can say is it's very interesting that all of these people attributed to the tombs and the opening of them all seem to die around the same time in weird circumstances. 1, 2, yeah, that's a coincidence. A dozen, maybe not so much. Where there is smoke, there is often fire. So was there a curse? Is there a curse? Is it just a coincidence or retribution from the souls of Egypt's most famous rulers? I cannot say for certain, but you can go to Egypt and you can fuck around and you can find out for yourself.